I was sitting at an elegant dining table in Greenwich, Connecticut, surrounded by crystal and candlelight, when I heard my future mother-in-law whisper in French, "We cannot let her discover what happened to the last one." My fork paused midair. My breath caught in my throat, and in that moment I understood that the fairy tale I thought I was living had been built on a foundation of carefully guarded lies. My name is Jennifer Anderson, and I am 42 years old. For most of my adult life, I've been a French language professor at Boston University, teaching literature and advanced conversation to undergraduates who dream of studying abroad in Paris or Lyon. My love for the language began in high school, deepened during a year spent in Provence as an exchange student, and eventually became my career. I never imagined that my fluency in French, a skill I'd cultivated through years of study, travel, and passion, would one day become the tool that saved my life. The evening began innocently enough. Philippe Rousseau, my fiancé of 8 months, had been insistent that I finally meet his parents, Véronique and Henri, who had flown in from their estate outside Paris to spend Thanksgiving week in their American home. Philippe was everything I had once thought impossible to find: charming, successful, attentive, and seemingly devoted. At 45, he was a businessman who split his time between his import-export company in New York and frequent trips to Europe. We had met at a charity gala in Boston the previous winter, and the connection had been immediate. His easy laughter, his European sophistication, the way he spoke about art and history with genuine passion. But from the moment I stepped into his parents' sprawling colonial mansion in Greenwich that cold November evening in 2024, something felt wrong. The house was beautiful, certainly. High ceilings, antique furniture, oil paintings that looked centuries old. But the atmosphere was frigid in a way that had nothing to do with the New England weather. Véronique greeted me with a tight smile and an air kiss that never touched my cheek. Henri shook my hand with the kind of formality reserved for business acquaintances, not family. Philippe had warned me that his parents were old-fashioned and reserved, but this felt like something more. There was a carefulness in the way they looked at me, as though they were studying me, measuring me against some invisible standard I couldn't see. Dinner was served in a dining room that felt more like a museum, a long mahogany table set with porcelain so delicate I was afraid to touch it, silver cutlery that gleamed under the chandelier, and wine glasses that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The first course was a French onion soup, rich and perfectly seasoned, and I complimented Véronique on it, speaking in my careful, polite English. "It is a family recipe," she replied in heavily accented English, her tone flat. "Passed down for generations." Philippe reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, offering a reassuring smile. I tried to relax, but the tension in the room was palpable. Henri asked about my work at the university, and I answered carefully, explaining my research on 19th century French literature. He nodded, but his eyes were distant, as though he wasn't really listening. Then, midway through the main course, a beautifully prepared coq au vin, Véronique turned to Henri and said something in rapid French. I kept my expression neutral, my eyes on my plate, but my ears were attuned to every word. "Elle ressemble un peu à Claire, tu ne trouves pas?" she said. "She looks a bit like Claire, don't you think?" Henri grunted in response. "Peut-être, mais elle semble plus naïve, perhaps. But she seems more naïve." My pulse quickened, but I didn't react. Claire. Who was Claire? Philippe had never mentioned anyone by that name. I glanced at him, but he was focused on his meal, seemingly oblivious to his parents' conversation. Véronique continued, her voice lower now, more cautious. "Nous ne pouvons pas laisser découvrir ce qui est arrivé à la dernière. We cannot let her discover what happened to the last one." The fork in my hand trembled slightly, and I set it down carefully, feigning interest in my wine. My mind raced. The last one? What did that mean? And why were they speaking as though I couldn't understand them? In that moment, I made a split-second decision. I would not reveal that I spoke French. Not yet. Whatever secret they were guarding, I needed to understand it fully before they realized I knew. I forced myself to smile, to nod politely when Philippe asked if I was enjoying the meal. It's delicious, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Your mother is an incredible cook. Philippe beamed. I told you she would love you. But across the table, Veronique's eyes were cold, calculating. She said something else in French, too quiet for me to catch, and Henri responded with a curt nod. Then she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jennifer, Philippe tells us you teach French literature. How lovely. Do you speak the language well? It was a test. I knew it immediately. She wanted to know if I had understood their conversation. I shrugged lightly, offering what I hoped was a modest, self-deprecating smile. I can read it pretty well, and I teach it, of course. But speaking? I'm much better at understanding written French than conversational. Native speakers talk so fast, it's hard for me to keep up. It was a lie, and it tasted bitter on my tongue. But Veronique's shoulders relaxed slightly, and I saw the faintest hint of satisfaction in her expression. Ah, yes, she said. French can be quite difficult for Americans. Henri chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. Indeed. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I smiled. I made small talk. I complimented the dessert, a delicate tart tatin that I barely tasted. But inside, my mind was spinning. Who was Claire? What had happened to her? And why did Philippe's parents seem so determined to keep me in the dark? As we left that night, Philippe kissed me goodnight at my car, his arms warm and familiar around me. I think that went well, he said, his voice hopeful. They liked you. I forced a smile. I hope so. But as I drove back to my apartment in Boston, the city lights blurring past my window, I couldn't shake the weight of what I had heard. Veronique's words echoed in my mind. We cannot let her discover what happened to the last one. I had spent years studying French literature, analyzing the subtext in Balzac and Flaubert, dissecting the hidden meanings in Baudelaire's poetry. I knew how to read between the lines, how to uncover secrets buried in language. And now, I realized, I would need to use every skill I had ever learned, not to understand a text, but to uncover the truth about the man I was supposed to marry. Because somewhere in Philippe's past, there was a woman named Claire. And whatever had happened to her, his parents were desperate to keep it hidden. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, and I made a decision. I would find out who Claire was. I would uncover the secret that Veronique and Henri were so afraid of. And I would do it without Philippe ever knowing, until I was ready to confront him with the truth. The woman who had sat at that elegant table, smiling and pretending not to understand, was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, more determined. I had been underestimated my entire life, by colleagues who dismissed my research, by men who saw me as too quiet or too bookish, by Philippe's parents who thought I was naive. But they had made a mistake, and I was going to make sure they regretted it. The morning after the dinner, I woke to find Philippe's name flashing on my phone. 3 missed calls and a text message that read, "Morning beautiful. Coffee later?" I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. And for the first time since we'd met, I felt a coldness settle in my chest. The man who had kissed me goodnight just hours ago suddenly felt like a stranger, someone whose past I knew nothing about, someone whose family spoke of secrets in a language they thought I couldn't understand. I texted back a brief excuse about faculty meetings and buried myself in what would become an obsessive, silent investigation. If Philippe's parents believed I was naive and monolingual, I would use that assumption as a shield while I dug into the shadows of his life. My first step was deceptively simple. I went through every corner of my apartment where Philippe had left traces of himself. Over the 8 months we'd been together, he had gradually moved items into my space. A spare suit in my closet, toiletries in the bathroom, a leather briefcase he sometimes left on my dining table when he stayed over. I had never thought to search through his belongings before. Trust had come easily with him, perhaps too easily. Now I moved with the precision of an archaeologist uncovering fragile artifacts. Inside his briefcase, I found business contracts written in both English and French, correspondence with European clients, and receipts from restaurants in Paris and Lyon. Nothing unusual at first glance. But tucked into a side pocket, I discovered a small, faded photograph, a picture of Philippe, younger, perhaps in his late 30s, standing beside a beautiful dark-haired woman in front of the Eiffel Tower. She was laughing, her hand resting on his chest, and he looked at her with an expression I recognized, the same tender gaze he had once turned on me. I flipped the photo over. On the back, in elegant script, were the words, Philippe et Claire, Paris 2018. Claire. There it was, confirmation that she existed, that she had been part of his life. But who was she? And why had Philippe never mentioned her? I photographed the picture with my phone, then carefully returned it to the briefcase exactly as I had found it. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I needed more information, and I needed to gather it without Philippe realizing what I was doing. Over the next few days, I maintained the appearance of normalcy. I met Philippe for coffee, smiled through his stories about work, and kissed him goodbye with the same affection I had always shown. But every moment we spent together, I was listening, watching, analyzing. I noticed things I had overlooked before. The way he deflected questions about his past relationships, the careful vagueness when I asked about his life in France, the fact that he had never introduced me to any friends or colleagues from his European business dealings. One evening, while Philippe was in the shower at my apartment, I took a risk. I opened his laptop. He had given me the password months ago, a gesture of trust that now felt like a weapon I could turn against him. I navigated to his email, my heart pounding, and began searching for the name Claire. What I found made my blood run cold. There were dozens of emails, dating back to 2019, between Philippe and various law firms in France. The subject lines were cryptic: estate settlement, inheritance dispute, final documents. I opened one from a lawyer named Maître Dubois, dated March 2020, and read, Monsieur Rousseau, as we discussed, the investigation into Claire's death has been officially closed. The authorities have ruled it an accident and no further inquiries will be made. However, I must advise you that her family continues to contest the terms of the will. We will need to prepare for a prolonged legal battle if they choose to proceed. I read the email 3 times, my chest tightening with each pass. Claire's death, an investigation, an accident. Her family contesting a will. Philippe had been engaged before, or perhaps even married, and Claire was dead. I quickly searched for more emails, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I found references to the estate in Provence, mentions of Claire's parents demanding financial records, and a terse message from Véronique to Philippe. You must be more careful. We cannot afford another scandal. Another scandal. The words echoed in my mind, chilling and damning. I heard the shower turn off, and I closed the laptop immediately, my pulse racing. When Philippe emerged, a towel wrapped around his waist, he smiled at me as though nothing in the world was wrong. What are you thinking about? He asked, leaning down to kiss my forehead. I forced a smile. Just work stuff. Grading papers? He accepted the lie easily, too easily, and I realized with a sinking feeling that he had been lying to me all along, smoothly, effortlessly, the way a man lies when he has had years of practice. That weekend, I drove to the Boston Public Library and spent hours in the archives, searching through digitized French newspapers for any mention of Claire's death. It took patience and several false starts, but eventually I found it, a brief article from a regional paper in Provence, dated October 2019. The headline read, Young woman dies in tragic fall at family estate. The article was short, clinical in its details. Claire Dubois, age 34, had died after falling from a terrace at a private estate in the countryside near Avignon. The fall had been ruled accidental, though the article mentioned briefly that local authorities had conducted an investigation due to questions raised by family members. Philippe Rousseau was identified as her fiancé, and the article noted that he had been present at the estate the night of her death. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, my mind struggling to process what I had just read. Philippe had been engaged to Claire. She had died under circumstances suspicious enough to warrant an investigation, and he had never, not once, mentioned any of this to me. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Claire had been close to Philippe's family. She had likely met Veronique and Henri, dined at their table, been measured by their cold, calculating gazes. And then she had died. An accident, they said. But her family clearly hadn't believed it. And now I was in her place, the next woman welcomed into the Rousseau family's web. I thought back to Veronique's words at the dinner. We cannot let her discover what happened to the last one. They hadn't been talking about a scandal or an embarrassment. They had been talking about Claire's death, and they were afraid I would find out. But why? If it had been an accident, why the secrecy? Why had Philippe hidden his entire past from me? I printed the article, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my purse. Then I drove home, my mind racing with plans. I needed help, someone with resources and expertise I didn't have. I needed a private investigator. Through a colleague at the university who had once dealt with a stalker, I obtained the contact information for a discreet investigator named Robert Chen, who specialized in background checks and international cases. I met him at a quiet cafe in Cambridge, far from any place Philippe and I frequented. Robert was in his 50s, calm and professional, and he listened without interrupting as I explained the situation. The dinner conversation in French, the photograph, the emails, the newspaper article. "What do you need from me?" he asked when I finished. "I need to know everything," I said. Who Claire was, what really happened the night she died, whether there's any truth to the idea that it wasn't an accident, and I need to know if I'm in danger. He nodded slowly. "This will take time, and it won't be cheap." "I don't care about the cost," I said. "I need the truth." We shook hands, and I left the cafe feeling both relieved and terrified. I had set something in motion that I couldn't take back, but I also knew, with absolute certainty, that I couldn't marry Philippe without understanding what I was walking into. That night, Philippe called and asked if I wanted to spend Thanksgiving with him and his parents. They were planning a traditional dinner, he said, and Veronique wanted to get to know me better. I smiled into the phone, my voice warm and agreeable. I'd love that. But as I hung up, I realized the game had changed. I was no longer the naive professor they thought I was. I was hunting for the truth, and I wouldn't stop until I found it. 3 weeks after I hired Robert Chen, he called me from an unlisted number and said 5 words that changed everything. Claire's family thinks it was murder. I was standing in my university office, grading midterm essays, when my knees buckled and I had to grip the edge of my desk to steady myself. Murder. The word hung in the air like poison, and suddenly everything, the whispered French conversation, Philippe's evasions, Veronique's cold calculation, fell into a pattern I could no longer ignore. Robert and I met again at the same Cambridge cafe, this time with a thick manila folder between us. He slid it across the table, and I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were documents, translated depositions, photographs, and a timeline that painted a picture far darker than I had imagined. Claire Dubois was 34 when she died, Robert began, his voice low and measured. She was a financial analyst, brilliant by all accounts, working for an international consulting firm. She met Philippe in 2017 at a business conference in Paris. They got engaged in early 2019. By all appearances, it was a fairy tale romance, until she started asking questions about the Rousseau family business. He pulled out a series of bank statements and corporate filings. The Rousseau Import-Export Company. It's legitimate on the surface, but Claire discovered irregularities, offshore accounts, shell companies, payments that didn't match declared earnings. She confided in a colleague that she suspected money laundering, possibly tied to Philippe's father Henri's connections in France. She was planning to go to the authorities. My stomach turned. And then she died. Robert nodded grimly. October 12th, 2019. She fell from a third-floor terrace at the family estate in Provence during a weekend visit. Philippe claimed she had been drinking, that she leaned too far over the railing. The initial investigation found no signs of foul play, and the case was closed within weeks. But Claire's parents hired their own investigator. They found inconsistencies: witnesses who said Claire rarely drank, a railing that had been recently reinforced and was structurally sound, and the fact that Claire's laptop and phone, which likely contained evidence of what she'd discovered, disappeared that night and were never recovered. He slid another document toward me. Her family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, but it was settled out of court in 2021. The Rousseau family paid them €300,000 in exchange for their silence and a signed agreement not to pursue further legal action. Officially, it remains an accident. Unofficially, her parents believe Philippe or someone in his family pushed her. I felt the blood drain from my face. And no one was ever charged. Money and connections go a long way in France, Jennifer. The Rousseaus have both. I sat back, my mind reeling. The man I had planned to marry, the man who had held me and told me he loved me, might be a murderer. Or at the very least, he was complicit in covering one up. There's more, Robert continued. I did some digging into Philippe's movements over the past few years. After Claire's death, he stayed in France for about a year, keeping a low profile. Then he relocated to New York in late 2020, right around the time the settlement with Claire's family was finalized. It looks like a strategic move, putting distance between himself and the scandal, starting fresh where no one knew his history. And then he met me, I whispered. Robert's expression was sympathetic, but unflinching. You fit a profile, Jennifer. Educated, independent, but not wealthy or connected enough to dig too deeply into his background. Someone who would be flattered by his attention, grateful even. You were supposed to be easy to control. The words stung, but they were true. I had been flattered. I had fallen quickly, blinded by charm and the intoxicating promise of a sophisticated, worldly partner. I had ignored red flags because I wanted the fairy tale to be real. But I wasn't that woman anymore. What do I do now? I asked. Robert leaned forward. You need legal protection. If the Rousseau family believes you're a threat, if they think you know too much, you could be in danger. I'm not saying they'll try to harm you, but Claire's story is a cautionary tale. You need to document everything, secure your assets, and consult with an attorney who specializes in international law and personal safety. I nodded, already mentally compiling a list. I'll need someone discreet. I can recommend someone. Her name is Rachel Goldstein. She's based in New York, handles high-net-worth divorces and cases involving foreign nationals. She's tough, smart, and she'll help you build a case if you decide to go to the authorities, or if you just need an exit strategy. I took Rachel's contact information and left the cafe feeling both empowered and terrified. For the first time, I understood the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just about a lying fiancé. This was about a powerful family with the resources and willingness to protect their secrets at any cost. That afternoon, I called Rachel Goldstein. Her assistant scheduled an emergency consultation for the following day at her Manhattan office. I told Philippe I had a research meeting in New York and would be staying overnight. He didn't question it. Rachel's office was sleek and modern, high above Fifth Avenue with views of Central Park. She was in her early 50s, sharply dressed, with the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. I laid out everything: the dinner conversation, the photograph, the emails, Robert's findings about Claire. Rachel listened intently, taking notes. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with a directness that was both comforting and unnerving. Jennifer, you're in a precarious position, she said. If what you've told me is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt it, you're engaged to a man whose family has a history of silencing people who threaten them. Claire discovered financial crimes and ended up dead. You've discovered their secret. That makes you a liability. The bluntness of her words hit me like a slap. So, what do I do? First, you do not marry this man. Second, you do not confront him until we have a plan in place. Third, you gather every piece of evidence you can, emails, documents, recordings if possible, and you store copies in multiple secure locations. We'll prepare a legal strategy that includes a restraining order if necessary, and will notify the appropriate authorities about what you've uncovered. Will they reopen Claire's case? I asked. Possibly. If we can provide enough evidence that the original investigation was compromised, French authorities might take another look. But that's a long shot. What's more important right now is protecting you. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a woman I didn't recognize. I documented everything, screenshotting emails from Philippe's laptop when he left it unattended, recording conversations with a small device Rachel had provided, even photographing documents I found in his briefcase. I felt like a spy in my own relationship, but the stakes were too high to let guilt slow me down. I also began quietly disentangling my life from his. I changed the locks on my apartment, claiming I'd lost my keys. I moved important documents, my passport, financial records, the evidence against Philippe, into a safety deposit box at a bank he didn't know about. I told my department chair at the university that I might need to take emergency leave, citing a family health issue. All the while, I continued to play the role of the devoted fiancé. I attended dinners, smiled through his parents' thinly veiled condescension, and even helped Veronique plan a menu for Christmas dinner. It was exhausting, living 2 lives simultaneously, but I knew the endgame was approaching. Rachel and I agreed that I would confront the Rousseau family at Thanksgiving dinner, the event Philippe had invited me to weeks ago. It would be public enough to provide some safety, yet private enough to avoid a scene that could put me at immediate risk. I would reveal that I spoke French, that I knew about Claire, and that I had evidence they couldn't afford to ignore. The night before Thanksgiving, I lay awake in my apartment, rehearsing what I would say. Fear coiled in my stomach, but beneath it was something stronger. Resolve. I thought of Claire, a brilliant woman silenced because she had dared to seek the truth. I thought of the photograph of her laughing in Philippe's arms, unaware of the fate that awaited her. I would not be her. I would walk into that dining room in Greenwich, surrounded by wealth and power and secrets, and I would shatter their carefully constructed lies. And whatever happened next, I would face it with my eyes wide open. When Veronique Rousseau raised her wine glass at Thanksgiving dinner and said in French, "To keeping secrets buried where they belong," I set down my fork, looked her directly in the eyes, and responded in flawless French, "Perhaps it's time we stop burying them." The color drained from her face. Henri's hand froze midair, and Philippe's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like fear. In that moment, the carefully constructed facade shattered, and there was no turning back. The Thanksgiving dinner had been orchestrated with the same cold precision as the first meal I'd shared with the Rousseau family. The dining room in Greenwich was even more elaborately decorated this time. Autumn centerpieces of burgundy and gold, fine china with the family crest, candles flickering in silver holders. Philippe had picked me up that morning from Boston, cheerful and affectionate, talking about how happy he was that I was becoming part of his family. I had smiled and played along, all while the recording device Rachel had given me sat hidden in my purse, capturing every word. The meal began with the usual strained pleasantries. Henri asked about my teaching. Veronique complimented my dress with the kind of faint praise that felt more like criticism, and Philippe filled the silences with enthusiastic commentary about the food. I played my part perfectly, the polite, grateful guest who was just slightly out of her depth in such refined company. But I was watching, waiting for the right moment. It came during the main course, when Henri and Veronique began speaking in rapid French, clearly confident that I couldn't understand. Henri mentioned something about finalizing the New York accounts before the end of the year, and Veronique responded with concern about drawing too much attention after what happened last time. Then Philippe, who had been largely silent during their exchange, interjected in French, "Mother, we agreed not to discuss business during holidays." Veronique waved her hand dismissively. "Your fiancé doesn't understand us, Philippe. There's no harm." She turned to me with a patronizing smile. "I apologize, Jennifer. Sometimes we slip into French when discussing boring family matters. You understand?" I nodded, returning her smile. "Of course." But Henri wasn't satisfied. He leaned toward Veronique, his voice dropping to what he thought was an inaudible murmur. This one seems more docile than Claire. She won't cause problems. Veronique's response was the catalyst I had been waiting for. She raised her wine glass slightly, a gesture that seemed almost ritualistic, and said, "To keeping secrets buried where they belong." That's when I made my move. I set down my fork with deliberate precision, the sound echoing in the suddenly tense room. I looked directly at Veronique, and in perfect, unaccented French, I said, "Perhaps it's time we stop burying them." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Veronique's wine glass tilted dangerously in her hand, wine sloshing against the rim. Henri's face went from ruddy to ashen. Philippe's eyes widened, his mouth opening and closing as though he were trying to form words that wouldn't come. I continued, still in French, my voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I've understood every word you've said since the moment we met. Every conversation you thought was private. Every secret you thought was safe." Veronique recovered first, her shock morphing into cold fury. "How dare you? How dare I?" I switched to English now, my voice harder. "How dare you speak about me as though I were some convenient replacement for the woman who died under suspicious circumstances in your family's care?" Philippe finally found his voice. "Jennifer, what are you talking about?" I turned to him, and in that moment, all the affection I had once felt for him curdled into something bitter and unrecognizable. "Claire Dubois, your fiancé who fell to her death in 2019. The woman whose family believes she was murdered because she discovered financial crimes in your family's business. The woman you never once mentioned to me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Philippe's face cycled through emotions: shock, guilt, fear, and finally, a cold calculation that reminded me disturbingly of his mother. "That's absurd," he said, his voice tight. "Claire's death was an accident. It was investigated and ruled accidental. You're listening to conspiracy theories." "I'm listening to evidence," I interrupted. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I had prepared, laying it on the table between us. Police reports showing inconsistencies in the investigation. Emails between you and your lawyers discussing settlements with Claire's family. Bank records showing offshore accounts and shell companies that Claire was researching before she died. And this. I placed the photograph on top, the one of Philippe and Claire in front of the Eiffel Tower, her hand on his chest, both of them laughing. "You kept this," I said quietly, "hidden in your briefcase. A memento of the woman you supposedly loved. The woman whose death you've never once mourned in front of me. Why, Philippe? Guilt or insurance?" Veronique stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is outrageous. You come into our home, snoop through private belongings, make wild accusations." "I came into your home because your son invited me," I said, rising to face her. "And I started investigating because you made the mistake of discussing your crimes in French, assuming I was too stupid or ignorant to understand. You underestimated me, Veronique, just like you underestimated Claire." Henri finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "You have no proof of any crime. Claire's death was an accident. The authorities closed the case." "Authorities you paid off," I shot back. "Or at least influenced with your money and connections. But Claire's family never stopped believing it was murder. And now neither do I." Philippe stood, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Jennifer, please, let's talk about this rationally. You're upset, you've heard rumors, but this is all a misunderstanding." "Don't," I said sharply, stepping back from him. "Don't you dare try to manipulate me the way you manipulated her. I know what you are, Philippe. I know what this family is, and I'm not going to end up like Claire." "What do you want?" Veronique's voice was ice. "Money? Is this blackmail?" I almost laughed. "I don't want your money. I want you to know that I've documented everything. Copies of every email, every financial record, every piece of evidence I could find is stored in multiple secure locations. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I have an accident, if I so much as trip down a flight of stairs, it all goes to the authorities, French authorities, American authorities, and the press. The room was silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. Philippe's face had gone pale, his earlier attempts at charm completely abandoned. Veronique and Henri exchanged a glance that spoke volumes: calculation, fear, and perhaps grudging respect for the trap I had laid. "You've made a serious mistake," Henri said finally, his accent thickening with anger. "Accusing this family of crimes." "I've made the only move that keeps me alive," I said, "and here's what's going to happen. Philippe and I are done. I'm walking out of here tonight, and you will never contact me again. You will not threaten me, you will not follow me, and you will not try to silence me the way you silenced Claire. Because if you do, everything I have becomes public. The financial crimes, the suspicious death, the cover-up, all of it." I grabbed my coat and purse, my hands surprisingly steady. As I walked toward the door, Philippe called after me, his voice cracking. "Jennifer, please. I loved Claire. Her death destroyed me. I would never—" I turned back one last time. "Maybe you didn't push her yourself, Philippe. Maybe you just stood by while your family did. Maybe you just helped cover it up afterward, took the settlement money, and moved on to the next woman who wouldn't ask too many questions. But that makes you just as guilty." I walked out into the cold November night, my breath visible in the air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I made it to my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a long moment, shaking. Then I pulled out my phone and called Rachel Goldstein. "It's done," I said when she answered. I confronted them. "Are you safe?" Her voice was sharp, professional. "Yes, I'm leaving now. They know I have evidence, and they know what happens if they try anything." "Good. Drive straight to the address I'm texting you. It's a secure location where you'll stay tonight. We'll regroup in the morning and decide next steps." As I drove away from Greenwich, the mansion shrinking in my rearview mirror, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, but a strange, fierce freedom. I had walked into the lion's den and walked out alive. I had faced down a family that had successfully buried their crimes for years. And I had done it by using the very thing they had dismissed as irrelevant: my intelligence, my fluency in their language, my refusal to be the naive, docile woman they had assumed I was. Claire had tried to expose them and paid with her life. I would honor her memory by making sure the truth finally came to light. Whatever happened next, I was ready. 2 days after Thanksgiving, Philippe appeared at my university office unannounced, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate, and said the words I had been both expecting and dreading. "My mother hired someone to follow you, Jennifer. You need to disappear before they decide you're too dangerous to leave alive." I stood frozen behind my desk, my hand instinctively reaching for the panic button Rachel had insisted I install, while the man I had almost married confirmed my worst fears, that the Rousseau family's response to exposure was not surrender, but escalation. The days following my confrontation at the Greenwich mansion had been a whirlwind of strategic planning and mounting paranoia. Rachel Goldstein had arranged for me to stay at a corporate apartment in Manhattan, a sterile but secure space where I could regroup while we determined our next moves. I had taken a leave of absence from the university, citing a family emergency, and Robert Chen had begun working with Rachel to compile a comprehensive dossier that could be handed over to law enforcement. But I hadn't expected Philippe to reach out, much less to warn me. When he appeared in my office doorway that December afternoon, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, and beneath it all, a flicker of the affection I had once felt for him. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I didn't tell anyone where I was staying." "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly, closing the door behind him. He looked terrible, unshaven, his expensive suit wrinkled, the confident businessman replaced by someone haunted and desperate. "I came to warn you. My mother, she's not going to let this go. She hired a private security firm, the kind that doesn't ask questions. They've been following you, documenting your movements. She's building a case to discredit you, to make you look unstable if you try to go public." I felt the blood drain from my face. "And you're warning me out of the goodness of your heart?" "I'm warning you because I don't want another death on my conscience," he said, his voice breaking. "You were right about everything, Jennifer. Claire discovered that my father had been laundering money through the business for years. She threatened to go to authorities, and my mother. She convinced me it was handled, that Claire's fall was an accident. But I've never been certain. And when you walked out of that dinner, when I saw the way my mother looked at you, I realized history was about to repeat itself. So what happened to Claire? I demanded, my hands gripping the edge of my desk. Did your mother push her? Did your father? Or did you just stand by and let it happen? Philippe's face crumpled. I wasn't there. I was in Paris that night, at a business dinner my father insisted I attend. Claire was alone at the estate with my parents. When I got the call that she had fallen, I drove back immediately. By the time I arrived, the police were already there, and my mother had already given her statement. She said Claire had been drinking, that she leaned too far over the railing. The authorities accepted it because my family has connections, donations to the right campaigns, relationships built over decades. And you never questioned it. I questioned it every day, he whispered. But what was I supposed to do? Accuse my own parents of murder? Destroy my family? I convinced myself it really was an accident, that Claire's death was a tragic mistake. And when her family came after us legally, my father paid them off to make it go away. I told myself it was closure, that we were moving forward. And then you met me, I said bitterly. Another woman to fill the void. Another woman who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions. I loved you, he said, his voice raw. I know you don't believe me, but I did. I thought I could build a new life, leave the past behind. I thought if I never told you about Claire, it would be like it never happened. But it did happen, I said. And now your mother wants to make sure I don't expose what your family did. Philippe nodded, running his hands through his hair. She's desperate. The business is already under scrutiny from the IRS because of the documents you found. If this becomes public, if Claire's case is reopened, everything falls apart. My father could face criminal charges. My mother's reputation would be destroyed. And me, he looked at me with an expression of profound defeat. I'd be complicit in covering up a possible murder. You are complicit, I said quietly. The moment you accepted that settlement money and stayed silent, you became part of the cover-up. He didn't deny it. Instead, he pulled out a flash drive from his coat pocket and placed it on my desk. This contains everything. Financial records my father kept hidden, emails between my mother and the investigators who closed Claire's case, recordings of conversations I shouldn't have access to but managed to get. It's enough to reopen the investigation and potentially bring charges. I stared at the flash drive as though it were a live grenade. Why are you giving this to me? Because I'm tired of living with this, he said. Because Claire deserves justice. And because maybe if I help you expose the truth, I can live with myself again. This won't absolve you, I said. You'll still be guilty of covering it up for years. I know, he said. But at least I won't be guilty of letting it happen again. After Philippe left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, holding the flash drive and trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe his motives were genuine, that guilt and conscience had finally won out over family loyalty. But another part of me, the part that had learned to trust no one over the past month, wondered if this was another manipulation, another trap set by the Rousseau family. I called Rachel immediately. She arrived at my office within an hour, and together we reviewed the contents of the flash drive on her encrypted laptop. What we found was damning beyond anything I had uncovered on my own. There were bank records showing systematic money laundering through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. There were emails between Veronique and a French police captain discussing discretion in exchange for a substantial donation to the local police benevolent fund. And most chillingly, there was an audio recording, apparently captured by security cameras at the estate, of an argument between Claire and Veronique the night Claire died. Rachel played the recording, and I listened with growing horror as Claire's voice, angry and determined, accused Veronique of criminal activity and threatened to expose everything. Veronique's response was cold and controlled. You will destroy this family over your self-righteous principles? You are a foolish girl who doesn't understand how the world works. Claire's voice rose. I understand that you're criminals, and I won't be part of it. There was a sound of movement, indistinct voices, and then nothing. The recording ended abruptly. "That's not definitive proof of murder," Rachel said carefully. "But combined with everything else, it's enough to demand a new investigation." Over the next week, Rachel coordinated with law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic. She contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division about the money laundering, and she reached out to French authorities about reopening Claire's case. The evidence was overwhelming, and by mid-December, formal investigations had begun. The fallout was swift and brutal. Henri Rousseau was indicted on multiple counts of money laundering and tax evasion. Véronique was named as a person of interest in Claire's death, and French prosecutors announced they were reviewing the original investigation for evidence of corruption. Philippe, in exchange for his cooperation and the evidence he provided, was offered a plea deal that would keep him out of prison, but require him to testify against his parents. As for me, I was placed under protective custody for 2 weeks while the initial arrests were made. The media picked up the story: socialite family under investigation for murder and financial crimes, and suddenly I was thrust into a spotlight I had never wanted. Reporters camped outside my apartment, my university, anywhere they thought I might appear. Through it all, Rachel shielded me as much as possible, giving carefully worded statements on my behalf and ensuring that my role was framed as that of a whistleblower rather than a scorned fiancé seeking revenge. In late December, I received a call from Claire's mother, Madame Dubois. She spoke in heavily accented English, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. "For 5 years, we have known in our hearts that our daughter did not die by accident. But we had no power, no resources to fight such a family. You gave Claire a voice when she no longer had one." I cried then, the first real tears I had allowed myself since the nightmare began. "I'm sorry I couldn't save her," I whispered. "But you did," Madame Dubois said gently. "You saved her memory. You saved her truth. And perhaps you saved yourself." When the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and thought about the woman in the photograph, laughing in front of the Eiffel Tower, unaware of the fate that awaited her. Claire had been brave enough to stand against corruption, and it had cost her everything. But because of her courage, and perhaps because of mine, the truth had finally emerged. The Rousseau family's carefully constructed empire of lies had fallen, and I had survived. 6 months after Véronique Rousseau was formally charged with obstruction of justice in Claire's death investigation, I stood in a small cemetery outside Avignon, France, placing white roses on Claire Dubois' grave, while her mother held my hand and whispered, "She would have been proud of you." In that moment, surrounded by lavender fields and the quiet dignity of a life finally honored, I understood that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's simply about refusing to let the truth die with the victims. The winter and spring of 2024 had been a crucible that reshaped every aspect of my existence. The investigations into the Rousseau family consumed headlines for months, each revelation more damning than the last. Henri Rousseau was convicted on 14 counts of money laundering and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Véronique, while not charged directly with Claire's murder due to insufficient evidence, faced obstruction of justice charges for her role in influencing the original investigation. She ultimately accepted a plea deal that included 3 years of prison time and permanent forfeiture of her assets in the United States. Philippe's fate was more complicated. His cooperation with prosecutors earned him immunity from criminal prosecution, but the court of public opinion was less forgiving. His business collapsed, investors fled, and his reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The last I heard, he had moved to somewhere in Southeast Asia, trying to rebuild a life far from the wreckage of his family's legacy. As for me, I returned to Boston University in February, though the woman who walked back into her classroom was fundamentally different from the one who had left. My students knew nothing of the real story. To them, I was simply Professor Anderson, who had taken a leave of absence for personal reasons. I preferred it that way. Normalcy became a kind of sanctuary. But teaching French literature took on new dimensions. When I discussed Balzac's exploration of social corruption or Zola's unflinching examination of moral decay, I spoke with an authority born from lived experience. I had seen firsthand how wealth and power could corrupt, how families could sacrifice truth on the altar of reputation, how easy it was for voices to be silenced when they threatened comfortable lies. In April, I received an invitation from Madame and Monsieur Dubois to visit them in France. They wanted to thank me in person, they said, and to show me the life their daughter had lived before the Rousseaus destroyed it. I accepted, taking a week off during spring break. The Dubois family home was modest but warm, filled with photographs of Claire at every stage of her life. A gap-toothed child, a serious teenager, a brilliant young woman graduating with honors in economics. Her parents spoke of her with such love and pride that I found myself mourning someone I had never met, grieving for the friendship we might have had, the mentorship she might have offered, the life she should have lived. "She was so much like you," Madame Dubois said one afternoon as we sat in her garden, tea cooling between us. Strong-willed, intelligent, unwilling to accept injustice. When she discovered what the Rousseaus were doing, she could not stay silent. It was not in her nature. "I wish I could have known her," I said quietly. "In a way you did," Monsieur Dubois replied. "You followed the same path she started. You finished what she could not." Before I left France, they took me to Claire's grave. It was in a small cemetery surrounded by fields of lavender, the Provençal sun warm on my shoulders. I placed white roses on her headstone, her favorite flower, her mother told me, and stood there for a long time, thinking about the strange kinship between us. Two women who had loved the wrong man, who had stumbled onto secrets that should have remained buried, who had paid vastly different prices for their curiosity and courage. "Thank you," I whispered to the stone, "for being brave enough to ask questions, for leaving enough clues that someone could follow. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, but I promise your truth will outlive their lies." When I returned to Boston, I found that the media attention had finally begun to fade. There would always be those who remembered the scandal, who whispered when I walked past. But increasingly, I was simply Jennifer Anderson again, a French professor with a particular interest in 19th century literature and a quiet life in Cambridge. But I wasn't the same woman I had been before Philippe. I was more cautious now, slower to trust, more aware of the masks people wore and the secrets they kept. I had learned that love could be a weapon, that charm could hide cruelty, and that sometimes the people who seemed most civilized were capable of the most barbaric acts. Yet I had also learned my own strength. I had discovered that intelligence and preparation could be more powerful than wealth, that speaking truth in the right language at the right moment could shatter carefully constructed lies, and that survival sometimes required becoming someone you never thought you could be. In June, I received one final message from Philippe. It was a short email sent from an untraceable account. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything. My family destroyed Claire, and they would have destroyed you too if you hadn't been strong enough to fight back. I hope you find peace, Jennifer. You earned it. P." I read it once, then deleted it without responding. Philippe's guilt was his own burden to carry. Mine was learning to live with the knowledge of what I had uncovered, the lives that had been shattered, and the justice that had come too late for the woman who deserved it most. As autumn approached and a new academic year began, I stood in my classroom on the first day of classes and looked out at a sea of young, hopeful faces. They were here to learn French, to understand literature, to prepare for careers or adventures abroad. They had no idea that their professor had spent the past year dismantling a criminal empire, exposing a possible murder, and learning that the language she had devoted her life to studying had ultimately been the key to her survival. "Welcome to advanced French literature," I said, my voice steady and confident. "This semester, we'll be exploring works that examine power, corruption, and the courage it takes to speak truth in the face of overwhelming pressure. We'll read Camus, Sartre, and Beauvoir. We'll discuss what it means to live authentically in a world built on convenient lies." As I spoke, I thought of Claire Dubois, who had died trying to expose truth. I thought of the dinner table in Greenwich, where I had first heard the words that set everything in motion. I thought of the flash drive Philippe had given me, the investigations that followed, and the long, painful process of justice delayed but not denied. And I thought of the lesson I would carry forward for the rest of my life, that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is pretend not to understand. That silence, even when strategic, comes with a cost. But that speaking truth, even when terrifying, even when it shatters your world, is the only way to truly be free. I had walked into a fairy tale and discovered a nightmare. But I had walked out alive, with my dignity intact and my conscience clear. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered.